Welcome to A Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy, a podcast about geek culture by lawyers, with your hosts, Ben Siders and Kirk Damon.
Today's episode is brought to you by the Imperial Detention Officers Association, Local AA23. Everything is under control. Situation normal. We had a slight weapons malfunction, but everything's perfectly all right now. We're fine. We're all fine here now. Thank you. How are you?
And welcome back to A Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy, the podcast that asks interesting questions that don't have any answers, with your host, Ben Siders, that's me, and the other guy is Kirk Damon.
That's Kirk, as in the captain of the Enterprise.
We are IP lawyers and certified geeks practicing law in St. Louis, Missouri. You can find me, Ben, on Twitter at Benjamin Siders, and you can find Kirk at KirkDMN. You can follow this podcast on Twitter at LGGPod and find all of this information on our very modern and sophisticated website, lggpodcast.com.
Yep.
We're running a little behind on episodes right now due to general busyness, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. Kirk and I both have very busy September and Octobers coming up, and in fact, we're both going to be in D.C. in the third week of October. Yeah. Kirk's presenting at a panel there, and I will be there to watch. So, if anybody's in the DC area,
if there's shoes flying from the audience, or rotten garbage.
If anybody's there, let us know. We'll try and connect. So episodes may get spotty over the next couple of months as we work that out. Today's episode is going to follow up on our last episode where we mentioned Dungeons and Dragons. Today we're going to talk about, one of the weirdest areas of law we've come up with.
I don't say it's necessarily weird, but it's an interesting interaction between geek culture and the law in a very specific area of the law.
Yeah, and it's not IP, so we're a little outside of our comfort zone, but we'll do our best with it. We're going to talk about the rules in U.S. prisons, basically, governing the use by inmates of role-playing games and Dungeons & Dragons in particular.
Yeah, Dungeons & Dragons in particular, because that's obviously the one that's sort of most talked about, but a lot of this is going to apply to, I think, gaming, role-playing games, and sort of fantasy games, for lack of a better term, generally.
And we should warn you in advance, this episode, we're talking about the criminal law, we're talking about Dungeons & Dragons, we're going to get into some details of some cases. So we may have some more adult and mature topics than we usually discuss here just because of the nature of the subject matter. So if you happen to be listening to this in the car with young children present, you might consider pausing and coming back to this later when young children are not present.
Or at least listening through it on the first thing. I mean, it's not going to be like harsh language, I don't think,
No gory details, but we are going to be talking about criminal cases involving some pretty nasty people. So there will be discussions of homicides and things like that. Again, no details, but if that's something you don't want your young children to listen to or hear, now is your opportunity to change the channel and come back to this later.
Yep.
So we have a whole series of cases involving prisons and basically operating rules they have concerning inmates acquiring RPGs.
And RPG game materials in particular.
Yeah, this could be games, it could be game modules, it could be books, it could just be articles or magazines or things like that.
Yeah, and one of the ones that you can talk about is like the magazines associated with games too. I know there specifically is a case involving White Dwarf, the game associated with Warhammer, and Games Workshop games. There's probably cases involving Dungeon Magazine,
I'm sure.
One specifically for RPGs, but we didn't look into that.
Yeah, and we should say at the outset, we are not prisoners' rights lawyers.
By any stretch of the imagination.
We're not even really First Amendment lawyers, although we do deal with the First Amendment in the context of IP rights, where it does have a place. So we're going to cover some issues with the First Amendment and how constitutional law interacts with prisoners' rights, but we're not going to dive into the nuts and bolts of the prevailing legal standards governing those things, other than to note that although prisoners do still have constitutional rights, let's talk about this. The standard of review is different. Let's talk about how constitutional law, and we're not going to go too far into this, but Kirk, 5 minutes on how constitutional law is applied in a normal civil setting.
Yep, so let's get into, I think, constitutional law. And again, most of what we're going to follow back on this is effectively law school. We're not constitutional lawyers either. And so you're going to fall back on a lot of sort of basic law school. But what you bump into is effectively anything that involves the Constitution where Congress attempts to act. And the question is whether or not that's in violation of the Constitution.
We should say it's broader than Congress, too. Most of the constitutional limitations. So the Constitution fundamentally is a list of things the government cannot do.
Yes.
Or actually, it's supposed to be a list of the few things it can do, with some also things that, by the way, that also means you can't do these things even when you are doing the other things. Yep. That's the Bill of Rights. It's kind of been flipped since the New Deal, basically, where we all just sort of assume the government can do whatever it wants until a court says it can't. That's not how it's supposed to work, but for all practical purposes, that's how it does work.
Yeah, there's a lot of assertions that basically Congress will do whatever it does, and then the Congress will review whether or not those laws are constitutional. The key thing
the court will review.
The court will review, sorry.
And these rules, I was going to say, most of these rules apply to most branches of government.
Yep.
So definitely applies to Congress through the incorporation doctrine. It also applies to most state and local governments, which includes, and what we're going to study today, state prisons.
Yeah, so when we get into this, what we basically are bumping into is, particularly when you talk about the Bill of Rights, and the idea of a government entity of any form potentially abridging the Bill of Rights, which, again, is sort of that affirmative statement of this is what the government can't do.
Yeah.
Or at least maybe the other way is to say that what the people can do, maybe a better way of even looking at that. Those
the libertarian to me is going to chafe at that characterization. We have a 10th Amendment.
The thing that I think you get into in conjunction with it is these are subject to judicial review. Now, it's not to say that, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights is absolute. There are certain restrictions to speech. There's certain restrictions to essentially every element of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution.
That's a common misconception, I think, that people, because the Constitution is a constitution. By its nature, it is a framework for how the government is supposed to operate and sort of an allocation of responsibilities and powers. It is not an exhaustive list of minutia of how things work. And so it says things in
It's
broad...
only 2 pages long.
Yeah, it says things in broad, unqualified terms like Congress shall pass no law abridging the freedom of speech. But from the very outset, Congress passed laws abridging the freedom of speech.
Yeah, and that's what you bump into. But basically what it comes down to, and I think you'll learn this very quickly, if you end up taking constitutional law, you go to law school and sort of constitutional laws, if it's not required, it's usually one of the highly suggested classes. That's what it was for me. The thing that you basically bump into is that these are reviewed by the courts under what's called strict scrutiny.
Yep.
And this gets at, when people talk about courts, and we've talked about this a little bit before on this podcast, there's 2 things to always keep in mind, and these things are, whenever you have a dispute and it goes to the courts, there are 2 very core fundamental things which are related to how you resolve the dispute. The first one of which is effectively who has the burden of proof.
Yeah, who's responsible for making their case?
Yeah, who's responsible for making their case? The way
usually
I always
the
put
plaintiff.
Yeah, it's usually the plaintiff. And the way I always put what burden of proof means is, in the event that you walk into court and nobody presents any information, which side wins?
Yeah.
And that's the idea, is that side doesn't, the other side has the burden of proof. They have to disprove something, or they have to affirmatively prove something.
The way it's described in law school is if someone files a lawsuit against you as the defendant, you're not legally obligated to do anything to defend yourself. It's all on the plaintiff to prove their case. And if they can't prove it, you're not obligated to disprove it. Now, as a practical matter, you do, because you want to win. But if the plaintiff, like you said, if the plaintiff just shows up and says, I'm suing Kirk because he smiled at me when I saw him on the street today, as a defendant, I'm just going to say, I demur, because that's not illegal, you know?
Exactly. And that's the kind of thing with it. And again, so in that case, the plaintiff has the burden of proof. They're the one who has to go out and affirmatively prove something happened. They also have to prove that that something that happened is actually a violation of the law.
Yeah.
And keeping in mind, the Constitution is a law. That's what effectively it is. But when we get into this idea of burden of proof, what you have in the case of strict scrutiny in conjunction with it is, under strict scrutiny, the government entity essentially always has the burden of proof. And then you bump into, once you have who has the burden of proof, it's how well do you have to prove it?
Yeah.
Do I just simply have to prove it better than the other side did? Do I have to prove it much better than the other side did? And there's a variety of different sort of levels that are thrown out. And they all have fancy legal terms associated with them. Beyond a reasonable doubt being the one most people are familiar with. Clear and convincing evidence,
which nobody knows what that means.
That means more likely than not.
No, preponderance.
Preponderance of the
evidence. So the
evidence.
standards of proof, preponderance is the basic standard. It means more likely than not. So something more than 50%. Then you've got beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the
clear and
criminal.
convincing evidence comes next.
Well, that's between. So you got beyond a reasonable doubt is the criminal law standard. It's not beyond all shadow of a doubt, which is a ridiculous standard, which I don't think we actually use anywhere. But
no, not really.
And then somewhere between reasonable doubt and preponderance is clear and convincing evidence, and I don't think anybody really knows what that means, other than more than preponderance, but less
more than preponderance and less than clear and convincing. So that's
the standard of proof, which is how persuasive your evidence has to be. And they say, well, I can see both sides. It's about 50-50, so plaintiff wins. No, that's not the case for clear and convincing.
Yep.
And then there's what do you have to prove? And so for strict scrutiny means that the government, basically when you want to challenge an act of the government, the courts are going to take a look at it. But because we have separation of powers, the court is an inherently weak branch. We don't have a judicial police force really in the U.S. I mean, we got the marshals, but if you've been to the courthouse, they're not chasing anybody down, right? No disrespect intended. I love the Marshal Service, but it's been incorrectly romanticized by television programs.
Mostly security. I mean, that's a lot of what they're doing. Is providing the court security.
They do all that kind of stuff. But so the courts don't have a ton of ability to enforce their rulings. They really rely in our country on voluntary compliance and respect for what they do. So they've got to be careful not to be too aggressive in overthrowing things that the executive does, that the legislature does. And so the court system has come up with these different standards of review, which is basically if someone's challenging an act of Congress or something the governor did or a rule in a prison or even, school policies, how closely are we going to look at that?
Yep.
And for most things, they use what's called rational basis. If the court itself can come up with a rational basis for why whatever the rule is that's being challenged has been enacted, then they're going to leave it alone. So this is why most of the government gets away with doing a lot of stuff that, when you read the Constitution, you'd think they shouldn't be allowed to do that.
The one place that ends is when it becomes a direct sort of implication of the Constitution itself, and that's when you bump into strict
rights,
scrutiny.
fundamental rights, things like that.
Yep.
So, so First Amendment gets strict scrutiny, which is the highest level, and I don't know the formulation offhand, but basically, whatever regulation is put in place, must I forget how it was phrased, but there must be a compelling government interest,
and
it must be narrowly tailored or the least restrictive way of achieving that compelling government interest.
Yep.
And what this means in practice for First Amendment is that regulations governing the time and place of speech, if they're otherwise content neutral, are generally permitted.
Yep.
But regulations that discriminate certain types of speech in favor of others generally are not.
Yeah.
So the library can say, the meeting rooms are available from 9 to 5. After that, we're going to go home because we're going to close. And
all the doors are going to be locked and nobody's allowed inside.
Nobody's allowed inside. Everybody's being treated the same. So that's a time and place restriction. Or we're going to protest, the president's coming. We're going to protest. Okay, we're going to set up the protest area and you're going to get a permit to be there so we know who's there. And we're going to keep the potentially incendiary groups apart for public safety, right? These are all good reasons to do this.
Yep.
But everybody who wants to show up and protest gets to. Right?
Yep.
Those are all fine. Versus nobody can play Dungeons and Dragons in the meeting rooms at the library. Well, that's discriminating on the basis of the content.
The content.
Speech. That's a lot harder to do.
Yeah, now we're talking the content of the speech. And that's, I think, where we want to go with this and sort of talking about it is what we're talking about here is specifically content restriction. This is Dungeons and Dragons or role-playing games versus other forms of content. There's no question that prisoners are allowed certain books. They are, entitled to certain forms of media. In conjunction with this, they're entitled to personal interactions in some cases. But we're talking about the particular content being role-playing games. And so that's where we wanted to get into this idea of sort of judicial review. I think the key thing we now need to get into is when we talked all this about strict scrutiny.
It's not the case in prison.
It doesn't apply in prisons.
Yeah, so we're not going to get deep into the nuts and bolts of prisoners' rights. There is a whole body of law that governs this. But the short version is prisoners still have constitutional rights. But there's a Supreme Court ruling from, I think, the 60s that sets out a 4-part analytical framework for when those rights are improperly and unconstitutionally infringed versus when they're not. And the reason, and it flips the burden around. So in a normal case, if you and I challenge the library's ruling that I can't rent a room or reserve a room for my Dungeons and Dragons group, we would win that case, right? Because it's discriminating for no good reason. On the
strict scrutiny at that point in time, you have the library being a government entity. It's almost a slam dunk win for us.
Which is why nobody does that. Prison is different, and the burden would be on the library or the city to make their case, to establish what the compelling government interest is, and to prove that this is a narrowly tailored solution to accomplish
content neutral
that.
generally and stuff like that.
Yeah, so. It won't have an unnecessary chilling effect.
And it clearly does.
Prison is different. In prison, the burden is on the inmate to challenge the regulation and establish that there's no rational basis for it. So it's more like that lower standard. And I'm really, really oversimplifying, but we've already spent 5 minutes on constitutional law, and I don't want us to get too far down into those weeds. So,
but the real key with it is here is and I think what we want to be talking about is the default position here is effectively the prison is right.
Yeah, we just assume that they're right unless the prisoner can prove otherwise.
Yes.
Which you can imagine is really hard to do.
Yep.
So we're going to look at a couple of cases. We should also also note we're not. This may come across as us criticizing prison policies a little bit because as we get into this, we don't find a lot of this all that persuasive. But Kirk, have you ever run a prison?
No.
Other than I have 5 children and 3 dogs, I haven't either.
You might want to run one.
Yeah, it feels like that sometimes. I have no idea what's involved in running a prison.
Yep.
So we're not second-guessing the administrative judgments made by these folks. We're just looking at this purely from like a theoretical, philosophical sort of standpoint as a legal framework and how these things play out.
And in some sense, we're tying this back to our last episode and the fact of, that D&D is oftentimes misunderstood.
Yeah.
And that I think what we're going to try to find in conjunction with this is how much of that is continuing to play out in this particular scenario. In a legal system.
Like the social attitudes about this are reflected in how it's being treated legally.
And we picked this as the legal system because this is one of the few places where D&D truly hits up against a legal system.
It still blows my mind that we have this weird little area.
Yeah.
So let's talk about some cases. Glassman versus Yates, Eastern District of California, 2011. Now, according to the decision, the inmate, Mr. Glassman, was incarcerated by the state of California at Pleasant Valley State Prison in Fresno County. I only mention that because that's where Sirhan Sirhan was incarcerated after he shot Bobby Kennedy. So Glassman ordered a copy of something called The Forgotten Temple of Therisden. That sounds like a very
it sounds like a Dungeons and Dragons supplement, yes.
Just on the surface level, being imprisoned in California and having the guts to order something called the Forgotten Temple of Therisden and having other inmates know that you maybe have it, that takes some chutzpah.
It is California.
It is California. Maybe it's not so unusual there. Anyway, prison officials confiscated it when it got to the mailroom, and they told Glassman that it was banned because it violated something called Operating Procedure 59RR14, which bans any materials containing, quote, coded messages or any other item that may be deemed a threat to the safety or security of the prison, end quote.
Yep.
Well, Kirk, just off the bat, which one of those two, coded messages or threats to safety, do you think Dungeons & Dragons materials implicate?
Neither, quite frankly, I can see it being either.
Yeah, when I first read this, I thought, well, where is this going? Well, let's find out. So Glassman appealed, and he was told that the prison bans all magazines or articles relating to Dungeons & Dragons or any other trading card, collector card, or RPG because the materials contain hidden messages or codes, and it would place an excessive burden on prison officials to decode the messages so they could be safely allowed in the prison.
Yep.
So let's just stop there. Does this make sense?
I'm going to jump on one piece of it. Trading and collector cards, to me, totally makes sense. Because obviously those are not something that, you very readily could encode a message in trading cards because you're not sending the entire set every single time you send something. Yeah. That's obviously part of it. If you look at it and you take any trading card game, there's different rarities, there's different associations. You could readily build a code around collectible cards that would be impossible for anybody not involved with the code to comprehend quickly.
And we do see this happen. I interned at the U.S. Attorney's Office, and just, this is all public information. You go to sentencing hearings, and they talk about how elaborate the codes are for drug transactions and things like that. So there are very sophisticated coding systems, linguistic systems that are developed by criminal enterprises to do some of what they do and make them harder to prosecute. So it's not a crazy concern.
Now, the other aspect you get into, though, is that this is a book. Ultimately, this is, what we're talking about is the Forgotten Temple of Therisden. I'm assuming is a book, is a source book of some form.
Yeah.
Now, it may have other aspects to it. We don't know that, but I've treated it as it's a source book. It's purely printed matter. Something along those lines. And so now it bumps into the, how would this contain something that's a hidden message? Well, you could technically, if somebody sent it to them, they could obviously hide a message in it. They could reprint the book. They could do something to it.
I could go modify the D&D book to have some sort of hidden message that we've arranged in advance or something like that. It's not. It seems unlikely. It's not crazy. You could do the same thing with any other book.
Yeah, and that's the issue, is it applies to any other book. And we'd say to here is that the issue with this is that it bans magazines or articles relating to Dungeons & Dragons, collector's cards, or RPGs. So we have a very specific,
right? Just an article about Dungeons & Dragons they can't bring in. It seems very broad.
Yeah, it seems very broad, but it also seems very specific. We're not talking about games. We're talking about RPGs and Dungeons & Dragons.
Nobody's saying you can't have Battleship, right?
Yeah, stuff like that. And so we get into it feels like this is talking about the subject matter of role-playing games.
It feels like a very specific content-based discrimination that we're having trouble articulating what makes it unique. Like, what is this concern? And I guess I wasn't sure if they meant that it's easier to embed a code in a role-playing game versus, say, Harry Potter, or if they're saying that, as published, these works inherently contain hidden messages.
Or contain codes. Now, they do contain codes. They contain tables and
data.
Stuff like that. Data, but I mean, data includes codes and stuff like that. And the other thing with it is if we get into the idea that these things could have been altered or how they were sent, okay, it's one thing to look at it and say, yes, we won't accept anything from an outside party.
But I was going to order it straight from Amazon then.
You know, if I ordered it straight from Amazon, it's sent to me, you know, stuff like that. Now, this is 2011, so how sophisticated it would be to deliver something like that to a prison is somewhat debatable.
Yeah, but I mean, these rules have continued after this case.
Yep.
Anyway, at any rate, Glassman filed a lawsuit seeking relief on grounds that the prison rule was an unconstitutional restriction on his right to free speech. Well, let's stop there. My first thought on this is he's not speaking. You're asking to hear somebody else's speech, right? So, I'm not a free speech lawyer in this context, at least, but I mean, I think it's well established that I guess from the prison, do you raise a standing issue and say, no, TSR, I guess Wizards of the Coast at this point, they're the ones who have the standing to assert a free speech case on grounds that we're, preventing them from having their stuff distributed to, it's not a public place, but it's still public property. It's belongs to the state. It's a state prison, right?
Yep. And there's precedent for the fact of publishers raising those issues of their materials being banned in prisons. Yeah. I mean, Larry Flint being the outstanding example. I mean, he raised plenty of arguments that he was entitled to distribute his speech, as to what it was. And you have kind of got the issue there of, is this the right plaintiff, stuff like that. But
they didn't get to that.
We didn't get to it. The court didn't really pay attention to it. We're playing around with it just because this is like, we analyze these like law school questions, which means there's a question of standing here.
I've told you, when you become a lawyer, it ruins everything. Even legal cases run like, how come nobody raised the standing question? We've got a side note here. The defendant is John Yates, who is presumably the warden or the director of the prison.
Yep.
Let's stop there. Why sue Yates personally? He's not the guy in the mailroom making these decisions, so why is he getting sued?
When he's probably responsible for it.
Ultimately responsible. Why aren't they suing the state of California?
Because the state can't be sued.
Yeah, 11th Amendment. You can't do that,
11th Amendment, state sovereign immunity.
Yeah.
So he's coming after it and basically saying that it's not that the state has violated. Now, you could sue the state in certain aspects. It may also be, quite frankly, this may be a restriction of this particular prison. It may not be of the state generally.
It is a common practice, though, in the United States that you don't usually sue the government itself for violations of civil rights. You sue the individual representative, and that's how you get around the 11th Amendment issue. It's an historical oddity that we're not going to go into. Not going to go into, but it's there. Yates moved for summary judgment, which is really just the government, on three grounds. One, he's not the guy in the mailroom that did this. Somebody else at the prison did, so we've got the wrong defendant.
Although at the same time, this is a statute is what it is, so he's responsible for enforcing it.
That's a lawyer's argument, throwing that in there just in case we need to appeal that later because we lose on the main thing. Two, his qualified immunity, which is the same kind of thing. And then three, the more interesting defense, it's not unconstitutional. I didn't do anything wrong.
Yep.
So let's look at his reasons for that. He says the prison has a legitimate interest in maintaining security, and RPGs contain, quote, violent imagery and coded language that can compromise the security of the prison, end quote. And that there are alternatives available. There's other games, reading material, other leisure activities he can engage in. He also said that prison officials would have to read and translate, his term translate, all the RPG materials to ensure they did not contain violent imagery and then decode all the messages containing in the publication. Now, I don't know what he's talking about. Violent imagery, I do understand.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's violent imagery, and I think one of the key things to keep in mind with this, and we've talked about this in RPGs, RPGs have combat as an almost essential portion of them. So, there is some argument here, the fact that RPGs are a unique form of entertainment in the fact that they involve direct assertions of combat.
It's a simulation of fantasy violence.
Yep. And it's not just you watching it like it would be on TV. You are participating. You are acting it out.
You're directing it, yeah.
So, there is some argument there to say, yes, they do have violent imagery and they have sort of direct engagement in violent imagery.
Yeah.
They do arguably have coded language. I mean, something maybe in Dwarfish, something like that. But at the same time, it's hard to believe that that's coded language that can compromise the security.
That's the thing. Like, I don't see the connection between the four names of Gandalf the Grey, and whether I can spell my name in, the Dwarvish language and how that impacts the prison. It strikes me as being similar to, and we're going to get into this in more detail, it strikes me as being similar to if somebody had ordered a book written in a foreign language.
Yeah.
And it gets to the prison, they look at it, and they're like, what is this? I don't speak, pick a language. Just call it Spanish. I don't speak Spanish, and so I can't review this until if this is something that's acceptable to pass on to the prisoner, we've got to get a Spanish language translator in to look at this. I would imagine a typical prison in the United States probably has translators for multiple languages that are commonly spoken here besides English.
Now,
if they don't, they can find one easily.
Yeah, and they may also have something as well where it's just, hey, they have a pre-selected list of this stuff is acceptable, it's all been cleared, and you can't have anything outside of it. But again, what I think we're really focusing on here is it seems like this rule is specific to RPGs and RPG-related materials in a broad sense.
Who do you get to translate that? Like, I think what they're saying is, I don't know how to take a look at this. Who do I get to come in and say, yeah, this is fine. It's just a bunch of game rules and THACO tables. There's no hidden messages here. I think they look at it and they don't understand it and they don't know what to do with it, so they're just saying no. So that's the prison's basis for not allowing it in. So then the burden is on the Glassman to prove that there's no rational basis for this. And although I think, Kirk, both you and I, when we first read this, thought, this is strained, you can at least see how a prison official who doesn't really understand RPGs will look at it and throw their hands up and say, I don't know.
You can say this is a rational basis, and I think even as we say as RPGs, we can say that it could potentially be broader than RPGs.
Yeah.
We can look at this and say, hey, you're not allowed to have, fantasy novels because we can't review them. They may have specific violent imagery. I mean, let's face it, there is a lot of novels out there which have themes we may not want prisoners to have, many of which are bestsellers. And so it's one of those where you can believe that it's, hey, we need to know, we make a very limited list of things which are available, recognizing that most things are not available, and that's fine. Again, what I found sort of the interesting focus about this was the general focus on this being RPGs and Dungeons & Dragons in particular, of why that limitation, as opposed to it being fantasy generally, as opposed to it being, any kind of fictional presentation, any kind of rule book or game book. Why RPG? Why this?
Yeah, I think that's where we both had trouble really understanding the decision. It's not so much that these reasons don't, on some level, have some rational basis. It's that they also apply to all kinds of other things that they do permit. So
it
feels arbitrary. So anyway, the prison also cited to prior federal court decisions finding it constitutional to ban D&D materials, and the court in this case said, "Yep, those are all persuasive and show that this is rational." So let's look at those.
For this case as well, I think it's worth pointing out there are 5 cases previously which basically find the same conclusion. So there is a lot of grounds for this court to agree with them.
But this court cited to another case we're going to talk about, Singer versus Ramish, a 7th Circuit case out of Wisconsin from 2010. And this case, the one we just talked about, was a district court case. The Singer case went up to the Federal Court of Appeals for the 7th Circuit. So this is one step shy of the Supreme Court, folks. D&D being discussed at the 7th Circuit. In the Singer case, which formed the basis for the Glassman lost. We should just say Glassman lost, and he did not get to have his D&D stuff. But Singer had just had, Singer was another prisoner who had the similar type of problem, and the Court of Appeals in the Singer case had upheld a prison ban on, I'm going to read this, quote, written material that details rules, codes, dogma of game/activities such as Dungeons & Dragons because it promotes fantasy role-playing, competitive hostility, violence, addictive escape behaviors, and possible gambling, end quote. Yep. So the gambling is because you roll dice. And they're like, well, the dice can be used for gambling.
And quite frankly, yes. Yeah, they can be. They got a point there.
Yeah, but you can take a slice of bread and make a dice out of it.
But we can also take the dice away from role-playing games, and they're still playable.
Yeah. The inmate argued that D&D is a healthy pastime and prevents inmates from getting wrapped up in prison gangs and assists in the rehabilitative process. But the prison disagreed, and since this case was more aggressively litigated, Singer had a lawyer. I think he got a private lawyer. They assigned one to him. But the prison brought in an expert who had, quote, extensive training in illicit groups ranging from nationwide street and prison gangs to small occult groups, end quote. And he testified that fantasy role-playing games have, quote, been found to promote competitive hostility, violence, and addictive escape behavior, which can compromise not only the inmate's rehabilitation and the effects of positive programming, but endanger the public and jeopardize the safety and security of the institution, end quote. Specifically, his claim was that cooperative role-playing games mimic the structure of organized gangs because you have a dungeon master giving directions to other players. Kirk.
I just don't quite buy the expert here.
Yeah. The dungeon master doesn't really direct the players.
Last time I checked, the dungeon master was trying to be the opposition to the players.
Yeah, he's more of a storyteller.
Yeah.
You know, he rolls the dice for the other people.
But he's also the one who oftentimes you're all against the dungeon master. I mean, you got to jump into basic army boot camp. It's the inmates or the inmates versus the warden. Something like that. It's in many respects the players versus the dungeon master, or the privates versus the sergeant.
The players don't even get along all the time. Half the time the players are fighting each other over who gets treasure and stuff like that.
Yeah, and so the thing that I think is interesting about it is I found this argument that it mimics gang activity very intriguing.
Well, if this is all it takes to mimic gang activity, that you've got a group of people in a cooperative endeavor and one person's in charge, okay, well, then how does that not also apply to a prison stage production of Macbeth?
Yeah.
Nobody can be the stage manager because they're going to promote gang activity.
And that's the thing is that fantasy role-playing games have been found to promote. So one of the things I think associated with this is it does promote fantasy role-playing. Obviously, it is fantasy role-playing.
Yeah. But to say that is inherently bad. It promotes fantasy role-playing. Yeah?
Yeah, competitive hostility, yes. Again, we talked about the fact that these have combat elements of it. It does promote some form of competitive hostility. It does promote fantasy violence. Addictive escape behaviors I found kind of weird as a statement.
I'm not sure what they mean there. If they mean it's promoting addictive escapism, like escaping from your reality, or it's going to cause people to try to escape from prison.
I got
the
escapism.
first one I get, the second one I do not.
Yeah, I got escapism. And again, he sort of said the same thing, is that, the person, the expert testified to these things, trying to devote competitive hostility, violence, and addictive escape behavior. What I found sort of strange about this is from where? Where is the expert pulling this from, that these things are, causing this, and what's it
Well, he has it in the
from?
next quote on our page here. He says that D&D can, quote, foster an inmate's obsession with escaping from the real-life correctional environment, fostering hostility, violence, and escape behavior. End quote. Yep. So I guess are they saying that because he's going to sort of metaphorically escape from the reality of his imprisonment, he's going to also try to physically escape from the prison?
Well, I think
or just that they don't want him to have too much comfort while he's in prison?
I really get the latter. I mean, quite frankly, I get the latter of the idea that, hey, this promotes the ability to escape from the prison by being in a fantasy world, which admittedly, when you're doing a role-playing type thing, can be very immersive.
Yeah, that's the idea behind it.
Yeah. And so I think there is, it sounds like what they're saying here is not so much that this is direct encouragement of violence, so to speak, but it's allowing you to get into this fantasy where one, violence is allowed.
Yeah.
Especially if it's required in conjunction with the
It's generally
world.
an integral part of the experience.
Yeah, and it's inappropriate from the correctional environment of a prison. And I get where he's coming from here. I mean, I have to admit, I do get where this expert's coming from here, this idea of fantasy escapism. And if you take a prisoner who's supposed to be, rehabilitated, whatever you want to say purpose of prisons is.
But how's that different from fiction? How's that different from reading Harry Potter?
And that's what we bump into.
I mean, I don't want to offend anybody. How's that different from reading the Bible?
Yeah. And that's what I think we then bump into is you can argue that essentially anything fictionalized,
anything
which
allows
encourages,
me to get immersed in a story is inherently escapism.
Or encourages,
how's that different from watching football?
Yeah. But also, as I said, I think, this story in the Bible encourages positive behavior. Yeah. And the idea that you're supposed to is not that also escapism from the nature of this?
They seem to think that if people are not forced to confront the reality of being in prison, they won't be rehabilitated.
I find it difficult people would not confront the reality of being in prison if you're in prison.
To pardon the inescapable.
Yeah. But again, I find it very interesting as to what this thing is because this argument makes sense. But the problem with it is it applies to so many other things outside of D&D.
Yeah, if you accept this as a legitimate argument, which I'll just indulge for sake of argument, then I don't understand why this concern is unique to role-playing games.
And the one thing that I immediately jump onto it is, you mentioned it earlier, let's take performing Hamlet. Or reading Hamlet. Shakespeare here.
Shakespeare's also violent.
Very violent. And that book's about active murder.
Yeah.
I mean,
And in that book, it's not. I mean, if you're reenacting a book about murder, you don't have a choice. The story requires you to carry out whereas in a role-playing game, you can just choose to be a pacifist.
Yeah. And so that's the thing I think we really get into with this is I don't find this expert to be unbelievable. I think that these things make some sense, but it seems to apply to so many more things than role-playing.
Well, the inmate Singer pointed out that this has never actually happened where role-playing games led to gang violence and escapism and other kind of problems. And he said there's not a single instance of D&D leading to any of these issues. The court was unmoved and said, quote, "The question is not whether D&D has led to gang behavior in the past. The prison officials concede that it has not. The question is whether the prison officials are rational in their belief that if left unchecked, D&D could lead to gang behavior among inmates and undermine prison security in the future," end quote. Yep. So basically, we know it hasn't happened. It hasn't happened because we're limiting how much access people have to it. And if we leave it unchecked, it could happen. And I think that's a rational thing to...
And again, the key line there, and I think it is the prison officials are rational in their belief. Remember we talked about rational basis?
They're not saying this is the least restrictive way to do this. Yep. They're just saying, it's rational.
We're not dealing with strict scrutiny here. We're dealing with rational basis. And so what this court is finding is there is a rational basis to do this. And I mean, they're very specific as that's what the criteria is. Well, again, what I find sort of interesting in conjunction with this is that their statement is left unchecked, it could lead to these things, even though it has not. There's then the argument to say, well, any of the other things which are allowed could lead to it if they're not unchecked. However, since they've not been unchecked, it hasn't led to it, presumably. Therefore, why should we not leave it unchecked and see if it does? We kind of, again, bump into this question of why are we single-outing role-playing games versus other things?
If I'm the prison warden, I say I'm not going to leave it unchecked and then see if I have riots and gangs. Like we're gonna nip this in the bud because I'm in charge of running a facility where I have guards with families, prisoners with families. Yeah. I'm responsible for the safety of all these people. So no, I'm not going to just pardon the pun, roll the dice and see what happens. We're just going to say no because I don't know what this is. I don't know what's going to happen. Whereas we've had books in prisons for as long as we've had prisons. And, we're pretty comfortable with that.
The Bible has been allowed in prisons, I suspect, as long as there have been prisons, and we have not had major riots and gang activity resulting out of reading the Bible. So we're probably pretty safe in allowing
reenacting David and Goliath, right?
Yeah, exactly.
In the yard. It hasn't been a problem.
And let's face it, the Bible tends to encourage pacifism. So, I mean, there's a lot of argument there.
I suppose
the New Testament does.
This case was interesting because the inmate Singer got affidavit evidence from an expert, which... I was stunned when I saw that because he's in prison, first of all, so his ability to marshal resources is limited, and experts usually expect to be paid to testify.
I've got to believe this is his lawyer. That his lawyer is involved in this and is somewhat supporting this.
And it may be that also it may be that people involved in publishing RPGs thought, well, why would we not want people buying our stuff? Yeah. There's a lot of people in prison. They probably love to play something. So the testimony was submitted from Paul Cardwell, who was the chairman and archivist of the Committee for the Advancement of Role-Playing Games. Cardwell testified that there are numerous scholarly works establishing that RPGs can have positive rehabilitative effects on prisoners. Kirk, did the court buy that? No, they did not.
Now, one thing I think you bump into is exactly what I mean by role-playing games, because he didn't specifically say Dungeons & Dragons. He said role-playing games. Yeah. And I think this is where we also bump into anybody who's been to the leadership seminars and other things Dilbert loves to make fun of. There are role-playing games associated with those. You're going to be your boss for a while. Let's put you in this role-play. Those types of things with it. That's also a role-playing game that's not Dungeons & Dragons. It's not what we think of when we think of role-playing games. Mm-hmm. One does have to kind of wonder what exactly he's talking about in his conjunction with the expert. I'm going to be the devil's advocate for both sides, I think, in some respects.
Yeah, and I didn't read through his testimony or anything for this. The court did acknowledge the evidence, and I thought they were actually pretty deferential to it. They said it was, well-founded and credible and made sense, but nevertheless, they thought it kind of missed the mark. They basically said, even given that, just because it can have positive rehabilitative effects, that doesn't address the question of whether it could cause or lead to gang activity or other problems.
Well, and this is where I think we now get into the interesting piece of here, which is the way the court basically sort of weighs these two experts is they look at them, and I think they say they're both reasonable, but then they find for the expert for the prison because they cite to prior cases and prior other court cases that say D&D players have retreated into fantasy world and become disconnected from wrongdoing.
Yeah, and this is where I feel like this decision kind of goes off the rails a little bit. They basically said, there's plenty of prior case law, not about prisons specifically, but about people engaged in criminal conduct that that was connected to role-playing games.
And particularly the fact that the role-playing aspect disconnected them from their wrongdoing.
Yeah.
Which, now we get into that idea of what's the purpose of a prison. If we look at it and we say, hey, what they're worried about, again, kind of jumping back to the state's position in this.
We can't rehabilitate them if they won't face what they've done
squarely and stuff like that. Hey, if the answer to it is role-playing makes that substantially more difficult, we have a pretty clear rational basis, I think, at that point in time. Again, it's a low standard.
Accepting the premise, I would agree with that.
Yeah.
I just am skeptical of the premise.
Yeah, and that's exactly where I think we're going to go now. If we can prove that premise, if we can come in and say basically, hey, there does appear to be this connection between playing D&D and using it as an excuse for wrongdoing.
Well, here's what's interesting is the proof in this case was not anything that the prison submitted. It was the court going and looking at other cases, which I think is really unusual to say, here's the evidence, see this other case. So let's look at those cases. The court, and we'll go through them, but the court characterized them as, quote, persuasive evidence that for some individuals, games like D&D can impede rehabilitation, lead to escapist tendencies, or result in more dire consequences. End quote. So the first case they cited was Waters versus TSR. This is a case where a distraught mother had sued TSR over the suicide of her son. It's a tragic story, and we're not trying to minimize that. But in a legal case, you're supposed to put the emotional aspects of it aside and just look strictly and with stark cold reason at the facts. And the court in the Waters case concluded that TSR could not be found to have any liability for a person's suicide, and this is not unique to this situation. Generally speaking, courts are reluctant to attribute a suicide to somebody else.
Well, and particularly it's reluctant to attribute a suicide to somebody who's not even there. I mean, in many respects, you're talking about something which is, they're attributing it to a book, to somebody who's written a book, something along those lines.
The important takeaway for purposes of the prison discussion is that the court concluded that there was no evidence that D&D had any causal relationship to the young man's suicide. So that's the conclusion of the case. No liability for TSR, no evidence of any causal relationship. But the court says this is persuasive evidence that it's got a causal relationship.
But it's got a causal relationship, and I think that's what we're really bumping up against with these, and particularly talk about this case in particular, there's a lot of issues as to, standards of proof and things related to civil cases and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But you have a case which found no causal relationship, which this court is now citing as showing a causal relationship.
Yeah.
And this is a trend I think we're going to see here.
Yeah, and that one's unique because it's a civil case. The rest we're going to go through, there's three more, are criminal cases. But all three have one thing in common. The defendant is accused of capital murder that carries the death sentence. And in all three of these cases, the defendant is claiming insanity to nullify the mens rea aspect, so that, insanity on the basis of D&D, the game made me do it, to nullify the mens rea aspect to get out of the box of the death penalty. That's what they're doing.
Let's just, I'm going to pick on your fancy term, mens rea, just for the people who may not necessarily have it. Mens rea basically means the mental state.
Yep.
So first-degree murder and capital murder, which goes along with the death penalty, you have to have the mens rea, the mental state of intending to commit murder.
Yeah, it's premeditated murder.
Premeditated murder.
It's different from, I was in a bar fight and a guy, and I pulled a gun and shot a guy. That's probably still homicide, murder 2. It's more inflamed passion homicide, or maybe even self-defense, you could argue, which may mitigate that to manslaughter. Murder 1 is like, no, I planned this out and plotted it, and it's considered to be a worse crime.
Murder 1, in many respects, is what is performed by every mystery, crime novel villain.
Murder 1, yeah.
It's planned out, it's plotted out, it's intended. And the idea, in many respects, what these people are pleading in conjunction with these cases is, I'm not that bad. Yes, I killed this person. Yes, I'm going to prison for it, but you can't sentence me to capital murder. You can't sentence me to die because I'm not that far gone. And the reason I'm not that far along, that I didn't really plan this, is because
the mental state, right?
My mental state is disconnected from it, and my mental state is disconnected because I'm a D&D player. That's what these people are arguing.
Yeah. So let's look at these. So one of these cases, the defendant, it was a triple homicide the defendant was accused of. He argued that he was a victim of Satanism and occultism, and that his addiction to D&D caused him to be so disconnected from his actions that he had no consciousness of the wrongdoing.
I'm going to stop you right there, just because I want to specifically comment. Remember what the court said in this case. We are worried that D&D causes you to be disconnected from your actions and have no consciousness of your wrongdoing. It's exactly what he he's saying.
Yeah.
It's
not an accident that that's what the prison expert said.
Yeah.
They even had a psychiatric expert testify and say that for legal purposes, he could be considered unconscious at the time of the killings, which is crucial in the defense because then an element of first-degree murder is missing.
Yep.
And this is all this is.
Keep in mind, this guy is almost certainly going to prison after he defends this.
He's going to prison. The question is he getting murder 1 or murder 2? Yeah. Murder 2 is not a death penalty. It's a life sentence. Murder 1, they then have a separate trial on the sentence. Is he going to be put to death or not? It didn't work. He was found guilty of murder 1 and sentenced to death anyway. He appealed, arguing that he recently discovered brain trauma as a child. He has multiple personality disorder. And he actually argued ineffective assistance of counsel. The D&D defense was a dumb idea.
Yeah, and I think that's the most interesting thing in here. And let's just point out by the fact that the appeal didn't work either.
Yeah, it didn't work either.
But the key thing here is we have a court saying D&D causes him to be disconnected from his actions and have consciousness of wrongdoing. The exact same thing he argued to the court, which he lost, which he then later argued was ineffective counsel, and he retracts it. We have a court citing the court saying this is proof of this.
Another court cites this one and says, oh, look.
Yeah.
It's like they didn't even read the case. That's not what it says.
We seem to bump into this connection of the court saying, hey, we have these cases that say there is this connection. There's this connection to the fact that, D&D leads to disconnection from what your wrongdoing is. We have a second case that seems to say the opposite in the actual occurrence of what happens in the case.
Yeah, then we've got a Fourth Circuit case, Meyer versus Branker, very similar, a murder defendant sentenced to death, had sought to introduce evidence that he played D&D obsessively, that made him be detached from reality, didn't know what he was doing. Again, this is a defense tactic to try to avoid the death penalty. The jury accepted the evidence in this case, but didn't care. They sentenced him to death anyway.
Yeah.
And the district court later rejected his habeas writ, saying that it should be thrown out, and a court of appeals affirmed. So in this case, the evidence was accepted, but still not considered enough to mitigate a death sentence.
So we have our third case of them arguing, hey, it's connected.
Yeah.
And the court finding effectively, no, it's not. But then this later court arguing, yes, it is.
Then in 1986, we have an enlisted men at Fort Bragg, along with a co-conspirator, broke into the home of an elderly couple, tragically murdered them, and then stole jewelry, credit cards, and a TV set. Later caught by military police and arrested. They confessed to the murders and again argued at trial that they were obsessed with D&D, and that's why they did it. Again, the jury did not find it persuasive. They were also sentenced to death.
Yep.
And in that case, they'd planned it out long in advance too. I think their argument was they dressed up as ninjas and were doing like a ninja warrior campaign, and so there does seem to be some kind of odd connection there. But again, we have a case that's being relied upon to prove that D&D makes you murder, and then we have,
or at least disconnects you from the fact that murder is bad.
And then we have courts saying no, you're still mentally culpable enough to be put to death over it. So going back to the original case, the court in the Singer case is critical of the expert Cardwell for not really addressing the prison system's concerns with gang violence. They're saying he's kind of talking past the prison's expert and talking about this rehabilitative effect, but we don't find that persuasive because according to these cases, they're persuasive proof that it can cause these problems. But these cases all seem to say it doesn't matter.
Yeah, and the thing that what the court seems to be saying here, and I think the thing that's interesting about this is they seem to be saying people do make the connection that D&D could cause you to do things.
Yeah.
That's what these defendants are saying in these cases is they're making this connection that D&D made me do it, for lack of a better term. What they're really saying is by doing the D&D, in some ways you can say the D&D is a symptom of me being, the fact that I am disconnected, and it allowed me to become further disconnected. What I find so intriguing about this, and I think this is where we both agree, is we look at this case and we say, hey, we have two competing experts, and I think the court does a very good job of sort of saying the two competing experts are difficult to decide between.
Yeah, they both make good points.
They both make good points. But then their deciding factor for why one of them makes better points than the other is because these four cases support his position, when the answer is those four cases present his position, but the outcomes of them seem to actually not support it.
As a threshold matter, for evidentiary purposes, other court decisions and other cases aren't evidence.
Yeah.
Those aren't facts, And if you read the cases, they don't support the position, I don't think, all that well. Plus, I think, the judges have to know, right? If you look at these cases, everybody charged with murder one is going to argue the mens rea element. There's going to be some reason
it's because this mens rea element is a very critical element and a very hard element to prove.
Yeah, it's the easiest one to disprove, right? Like nobody else knows what's in your head, so I'm going to get some experts to say that I was crazy. And whether it's D&D or something else, he just got fired from his job that day, and so he was, in a disassociative state or something like that. I mean, if any of you watch like the Making a Murderer or any of these sort of true crime shows, there's always some sort of, it's traditionally called an insanity plea, but it's really just, nullifying the mens rea element so you can't get murder one and you get a lesser charge.
Yeah. And again, I think the thing that to me is very interesting about this is we're looking at this thing and saying, and I guess, let's sort of take it all the way to the end point here. I don't think the court necessarily is wrong in this case. The way they come to it and say, is there a rational basis to ban these things?
I think legally they're probably fine. According to the legal framework,
this
is probably how it's supposed to come out. Because the standard is so low.
The prison
doesn't have to.
But what we seem to bump into and what we found interesting about this and why we want to talk about it is it seems like the standard is for D&D in particular and for role-playing in particular, whereas the standard could apply to other things which it doesn't seem to apply to and are permitted.
Well, we saw like Texas, for example, you can have Mein Kampf in prison in Texas, a book written by a brutal dictator while he was in jail.
Yeah.
About overthrowing the government, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's fine, but you can't have Game of Thrones because it has maps.
Yeah, it's Maryland, by the way.
It's Maryland,
But the thing with that is, you look at these and it sort of seem kind of arbitrary. And what we thought about this, and this is where we wanted to get into with this question, I think, is an endpoint. How much of this ties back to, one, people don't understand what role-playing game is.
I think that's a lot of it.
And two, it ties back to the 80s of this is all about occult and Satanism and bad.
The moral panic. I think what we have is a resourcing issue, that you've got a prison that's got to sort through stuff being sent in. And they're looking at this, and I'm going to go back to my translation analogy. If somebody sent something into the prison that was written in, like, say, an obscure language that nobody in the prison
Ancient Egyptian.
Ancient Egyptian, Sanskrit, right? Something that's not widely spoken in California. It's not like it's Spanish or German where you can find somebody who speaks it. That's probably...
You might have somebody in the prison who speaks Spanish, quite frankly. I mean, they probably have to have somebody.
Yeah. But, where are you going to find someone who speaks Sanskrit, right?
Yeah.
That's not, or Old English, You're not going to find that anywhere either. There's like 5 people. So, if you had a book written in a language like that, I think it'd be reasonable to say, well, we can't find somebody to do, because then everybody's just going to order stuff in Sanskrit, and then we're going to go through and look at all this stuff.
Yeah, and that's the idea. Is I think there's something to be said for the idea that these are complicated rule books. There's a lot of data, and there's a lot of material in them. There's filled with tables and stuff like that. There is a very good, reasonable argument, I think, that this is a resourcing issue. They just simply can't go through it.
It's different from thumbing through a copy of Gideon's Bible to confirm that there's nothing in there that shouldn't be,
Yeah, or even a copy of Harry Potter, where again, like the text of it's going to be pretty obvious if it's modified.
But order it straight from Amazon, all right, I know what it is.
Yeah, you know what it is, you know where it's coming from, you know what it says. And so, again, treating the fact that we got to keep in mind, and when it comes to prisoners' rights, this is a rational basis. There probably is a rational basis here as to what we've got based upon the resourcing.
The resourcing issue is not an illegitimate legal argument. I mean, we do look at the burdens that applying these rules place on the government and the public, and look at whether the benefit really applies. I think that's not the official legal framework that's taking place here, but I think that's part of what the court is looking at is, look, if we say you have to go look at all this stuff, we're not going to say you're not allowed to look at it. And so if we say that the people are the practical consequence of ruling in favor of the prisoners is to tell prisons, if somebody wants to play a role-playing game, you have to review all this stuff if you want to screen it before it comes in, and you have to let them, which means you have to review it, or you'd have to just give it to them without checking it, which they're not going to do, or you have to go through the burden of checking it, which if it was just Dungeons & Dragons, maybe you can get up to speed, but are you going to have prisons responsible for screening every RPG and card game out there?
And keep in mind, some of these games are very violent. On purpose.
Well,
they're
very
designed
obscure
to be.
too,
Some of them are very obscure. Some of them, could potentially get into subjects. Yeah, but I think the thing that you really get into, and again, where I kind of bump into it, that I think is, and what our interesting piece about this is to, where it becomes interesting is, is part of this because we look at it and say role-playing games have this bad association with the occult that grew out of the 80s, which, is a moral panic, which there's a lot of argument that it has no connection with, which we've seen fall. I mean, there's arguments right now coming out of the fact that Harry Potter encourages the occult. There's arguments that Pokemon Go encourages the occult. There's all sorts of arguments like that kind of stuff out there. Do we have this lingering element of it? And the reason we particularly wanted to get into it, and the reason I think this episode is particularly sort of interesting to us, is this is one of the few places where we get into aspects of the sort of social pieces of geek culture, this occult association with geek culture hitting the legal system. And that's why we did this episode.
The stigmatization of D&D in particular, which was then broadened to all role-playing games. I think sort of the legacy of that lingers on in these underlying decisions. And it's not this decision specifically so much as you can point to prior cases where defendants could say with a straight face, the Dungeons and Dragons made me do it.
Yeah.
And you know what? If defendants are willing to blame D&D for their murderous activities themselves and say that it caused...
Even if it's ineffective.
Even if it was ineffective, but it's clearly in our social consciousness that it's a thing, right?
Yeah.
And so, and the fact that it sort of trickled up into this decision that we're going to treat D&D for really no coherent reason, different from other things that have all the same concerns, is like you said, this sort of projected reflection of a very now outdated bias that nevertheless in 2011, Glassman can't have Dungeons and Dragons. He can't have the Lost Temple of Theradune or whatever the heck it was.
And again, I think that's, from our point of view, and I think the real takeaway from this episode is not to say that we want to second-guess prison officials, not to say that this isn't a reasonable determination from the courts.
We're talking about people whose job it is to manage a giant concrete box full of violent criminals. Yeah. I'm not going to second-guess what they're doing.
And what we're really looking at is saying this is one of the few areas, and it's the reason why we've got to focus in it on prisons, where we have a social aspect and a social treatment of an aspect of geek culture truly impacting into the law in an area where that social aspect and that social treatment of it seems to be having an actual legal effect.
Yeah.
The idea that these things are potential, social looks at them and says, these are weird, they are a little risque on the side, they could potentially lead to this escapism, these dangerous behaviors. The court then looking at it and saying, because society thinks that, regardless of whether or not it's true, we have to keep it away from prisoners because society thinks that, and because if society thinks it, the prisoners themselves may also think it. It's an interesting impact. And again, that's, I think, the purpose of this episode and what we really kind of want to try to get across in this is one of the few areas, I think, where we have that kind of connection.
I can't think of anything else like this. I'm sure there's something, but this was such an oddly specific outcome. And, a lot of the times you and I, we're lawyers. It's our job to find a way to understand, right? Whatever side of the case we're on, I need to understand my opponent's side of something so I know what arguments they're going to make, whether they're any good or not, right? And this is one of these situations where I feel like if we never had the 80s moral panic over RPGs, would this case come out the same way?
Yeah, and that's really the question.
But I think it's much less likely.
Yeah,
because you can think of other things. I mean, do they allow pornography in prisons?
Yeah, I think they have, at least in some respects. And again, I think Larry Flint challenged it at one point in time. They do allow it in Congress because of the fact that he did challenge his ability to send it to Congress. But those are, I think that, and again, what we're really kind of coming to here is we had a moral panic associated with this. You're arguably still seeing the moral panic of the 80s falling out in 2011. But it also then bumps into these aspects of geek culture of misunderstanding of it. We can argue going back all the way to it. The entire thing is based upon a misunderstanding of
all
culture.
Of this, the mischaracterization of the relationship between the dungeon master and the players is the root of all of this. And I think anybody who's played D&D, it's weird that it's both it doesn't mimic gang structure at all. You're adverse to the DM in a lot of senses. Yeah. I don't know. I find it just such an odd. It was so jarring to read their characterization of there being hidden codes, and it was like something torn from the pages of Time magazine in 1986.
Yeah,
where you read it, you're like, you guys don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, and particularly, and that's, again, I think that's our purpose of sort of talking about this. This is why we sort of wanted to get into this as a second episode, and why this had to be the second half of this, is because we needed to go through that first half. And if you guys haven't listened to the first half and are potentially confused about what we're talking about here, definitely jump back to that first half and go listen to the last episode on the moral panics and this association with RPGs and gaming generally, with occultism, with Satanism, with negative behavior.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't dive deep into those cases, but we covered the overviews of it.
Yep.
It's an interesting little chapter in the legal system. Well, we're going to move on and do something different for the last couple minutes here. The Star Wars 9 teaser trailer dropped.
Second teaser trailer.
Was it the second one? Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
There was the one at Star Wars Celebration or whatever. At any rate, Kirk and I went out on the internet and found various predictions people are making and tweaked them a little bit. So we've got 15 Star Wars 9 predictions that are mostly by other people and some made up by me. We're going to go through those and true, false. I don't have a pen here, so I have to just remember. I'll go back and listen to this later and write them down. Okay, so here we go. And you can play along at home and let us know how much more right you were than us. Here's number 1. You ready, Kirk?
Yep.
Mark Hamill appears on screen as a Force ghost.
True.
Yeah, I think so. I feel like there has to be a mirror to the end of Episode 6.
Yes, unfortunately.
Hamill has the Obi-Wan role. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The other reason for it is I think they need him to appear as a Force ghost. They don't want him to appear as an actual character. He needs to be dead after 8, but they probably don't want him to be truly gone.
Yeah.
And the Force Ghost is the obvious way to do it. It completely fits with stuff that's happened in the past. Not going to be a problem to do. No fan's going to have any problem with him appearing as Luke as a Force Ghost. Of course, shouldn't he actually appear as Baby Luke, given what we did in the special editions?
That's not canon. Okay, number 2, Princess Leia dies.
True.
I'm actually going to go with false.
You're going to go with false and say she doesn't.
Here's why. I think she's going to be absorbed into the Force somehow in a way that we wouldn't be able to definitively say is dead. Although in that sense, is Luke really dead?
Yeah. I think she's going to die. I made the original prediction. You pulled it out of this thing, but she will die off screen.
Yeah.
As to what it is, it's not part of the thing with it. I think part of the reason she will die is I have the feeling they probably have some footage they can use with her as a Force ghost.
Maybe they have Leia appear as the Force. Yeah, Leia's the Force.
I can also believe
ghost,
Leia will appear as a Force ghost. And again, I'm kind of coming back to that end of Return to the Jedi Force Ghost scene. I can very well believe we're going to see Mark Hamill and Carrie Fisher appear as Force ghosts in that scene.
Number 3, we find out who Rey's parents really are.
Quite frankly, I don't care.
I don't either.
Really bad.
At this point, they've screwed it up so bad, I don't care.
My take of
I'm going to say
is,
yes.
I'm going to say false in this because even if they tell us who they really are,
I don't trust them.
We don't trust that it really, really is true.
Yeah, they'll play with it later. So I'm going to say that I'll say they tell us who Rey's parents really are. Let's go with that.
Okay.
So I'm saying true, you're saying false.
Yep.
All right, number 4, we meet more Knights of Ren. I'm going to say true.
I'm going to say true on this one, too,
They may have
actually.
actually the trailers. I don't know.
Well, we have the red stormtroopers in the trailers.
Are those Knights of Ren?
And that's the question is, what are those red stormtroopers? What are they? Are they something that comes out of it? We know we have Knights of Ren from, the Knights of Ren are the sort of the additional Jedi that go with Ben.
They're all gone. They've never been mentioned again.
Yeah, and so the question we sort of bumped into, I think there will be some things out there. What I can believe is that, one, it'll be left open as here's our future villains. But there's also the possibility of, something where it's, we need to be people because we need to have some explanation for how we get something else into the canon.
I put one in here before that said that they're going to introduce a future villain for future trilogies. But this is it. It's these guys.
Yeah, that's a possibility. Is I can believe a Knight of Ren will become a future villain for future trilogy.
All right, number 5, Snoke is back.
No? I'm going to say false.
I'm going to say true, but it's going to be in a roundabout way. They're going to, and we'll get to this later, but they're going to either travel through time, or it's going to be Snoke is actually Palpatine or something like that.
If we're going to travel through time, and then we have to put caveats on all of these. My take with Snoke is I think they truly want Snoke to be dead. Part of the reason I think they want Snoke to be dead is because we have hinted at Emperor Palpatine in conjunction with the trailers.
Unless they're the same person somehow, which would be
could be
super
the case.
Lame, but I think it's decent.
I've heard that theorized before. So.
I'm going to say true. Snoke is back somehow. 6, Kylo Ren is redeemed and becomes Ben Solo again.
Yep, at least when he becomes a Force ghost at the end.
Yep, true. 7, Finn and Rose become a thing.
This one I think is hard, quite frankly.
I think so, because they've really avoided any kind of overt romance in most of the Star Wars movies, except for a little bit in Empire with the love triangle, which was really underplayed. And then the only other one was Han Solo and Kira in the Solo movie.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't be surprised if they leave this pretty tame.
Yeah, partially just because of rating and stuff like that and their audience. My take with this is, quite frankly, I'd love to see it happen.
That'd be fun.
I would like to see them actually do this. I think it would be fun as to what it would be. It could be a very interesting storyline.
I don't think they know what to do with Finn's character.
I'm not sure they know what to do with Finn's character, which is also, I'm not sure they know what to do with Rose's character after episode 8 either.
Yeah.
And so it's one of those things where...
Episode 8 had a really final feel to it. Like they could have just ended the new trilogy there.
Yeah, sort of. I mean, except you do leave the few obvious cliffhangers.
Yeah.
But the thing that I had sort of with Finn and Rose, the reason I think Finn and Rose becomes a thing is a very interesting question, is I feel like this is something they'd like to do, but every attempt at romance they've made has not gone well. Attack of the Clones.
Yeah.
Let's take a certain scene that we all talk about in episode 2. They're clumsy at it. And so I've got to wonder if they're just going to sweep it under the rug because they don't trust themselves to do it.
Yeah. The only time the romance has really been successful is when they keep it at like not even a PG-13 level, like Saturday afternoon special level. All right, number 8, Captain Phasma becomes more than a prop.
We all love Captain Phasma. My take
she's
of this
the Boba Fett of the series. Everybody's obsessed with her because she's got a cool costume which doesn't do anything.
My take of Captain Phasma is no, but I will predict, and I'm going to predict it now, in the next 20 years of the continued universe, she will have her own series.
Oh, yeah. Gwendolyn Christie, she's great. She's so wasted here.
I know, and she has the potential to be a fun character. I could totally believe they're going to do something with her in the future, but I don't think it's going to be in this movie.
Number 9, there's another Death Star to blow up. And I'm going to say it doesn't have to literally be called the Death Star. It just is functionally
Star Killer Base.
Death Star. Yeah. So I'm going to say false. Wait, Captain Phasma, you said true or false?
What? I said false, at least in this movie.
I'm going to say false also. Okay, number 9, another Death Star. I'm going to say false. There's not a Death Star to blow up, but there obviously is already a blowed up one that they're going to go see.
Yes, and I think that means is that there's a something which must be blown up in order to resolve the plot.
That may be the most Star Wars thing ever, that we take the blowed up Death Star and blow it up again somehow.
Exactly. I'm going to do this thing. I'm going to say true.
Oh no!
And I'm going to say true because I'm not sure they know how to end the series otherwise.
I don't think they do either. We'll get to that in a second. Number 10, Harrison Ford appears on screen.
Again, I'm going to say true as a Force ghost.
Yeah, I don't know if you a Force ghost. I'm going to say true because this is the final send-off for all these characters.
Yeah.
That's why I think they're all going to have an appearance somehow on screen.
I think a lot of it's going to be Force ghost. It's going to be some kind of a thing at the end, which is basically a thanks type of.
It could be like a hologram or something, like a message he left or something. I don't know. There'll be something.
A fan service scene for nothing else.
Yeah. 11, a major character other than Leia dies.
You know my theory on this, and I have a theory that 2 of them are going to die. Mm-hmm. And it is Rey and Kylo Ren.
See, I don't agree. I think they're both going to survive.
That is. I am making the theory that both of them are going to die. So not just one major character, but 2.
If you hit on both of those, I'll give you double credit for that one. Number 12, a character from the prequel trilogy who was not also in the original trilogy appears on screen. So this has to be like a Jar Jar Binks or a Qui-Gon Jinn who is not also in the originals, and not a character from Rogue One or the Solo movie either. It's a tough one.
My take on this is true, but one of those things in it is do we have any of the actors associated? Have you seen any spoilers of any of the actors being associated with it?
Ian McDiarmid, but he was in the original trilogy too, so
so we've definitely got some sort of things with that. Could he appear as himself? I think the answer to this is probably going to be yes. We're going to see a character from the prequel trilogy. I'm not sure it's not somebody who's going to be in the original trilogy. I think that's my joke of Baby Luke, or Baby Anakin, sort of stuff like that. How
about this? An actor, like is there a Hayden Christensen appearance?
Yeah, well, there could be Jar Jar as a computer-generated character as well. But
Force Ghost Jar Jar
Binks. Yeah. Turns out the Drunken Master theory is true.
That would have been amazing if that's where it ended up, and you're like, what's Jar Jar all this time?
But yeah, I think the answer to this is we're going to see a character from the prequel trilogy, but I think it's going to be somebody whose character appears in the original trilogy, though they may appear as the actor not in the original trilogy.
Okay, the next one is my J.J. Abrams special. They never explain the remaining hanging threads from The Force Awakens. I'm thinking of a couple of things in particular. One is how Maz Kanata got Luke's lightsaber.
Yep, it was the obvious play into. It was important as to what it is. I think they actually are going to resolve this one. I do.
All right. The other one is Kylo Ren has a remark in The Force Awakens where he says, "Show me, grandfather, show me again the power of the dark side," implying that he had some prior epiphany involving Darth Vader or something, and they just dropped that and never went anywhere with it. So, because Vader was redeemed, so why would he be back showing Kylo Ren anything unless he's being manipulated by somebody? And that whole thing never went anywhere.
I think they're not going to explain that one. I
don't think they will either.
Too much of a throwaway. But
all right, so there may be a half credit for this one. We'll say those are the two: the lightsaber and the "Show Me Again" grandfather line.
Yep.
Okay, 14. I editorialize on this one. One of the following terrible ideas will
which gives you both of our opinions on these ideas.
One of the following terrible ideas will play a role in the plot. A, someone will time travel. B, someone is actually a clone. C, someone
is actually a clone. Finn.
Someone is Boba Fett's son or daughter.
Finn is a clone.
We don't know that.
He's a stormtrooper.
That doesn't mean he's a clone. The prequels are not canon.
We do know that there actually could be clones that are not the stormtroopers who are not clones. Yes.
And what's the third one? Someone is Boba Fett's son or daughter. So
somebody will try and pebble. I'm just going to put it by the editorial. I hope not.
Yeah. Like I said, these are all terrible ideas.
I don't mind a flashback, something that does a flashback. I don't mind something that does a dream sequence, kind of like we saw. I've definitely heard theories in conjunction with when you see Rey with the double red lightsaber and the phrase that is a cave-like sequence like Luke in the cave in Empire. I can very well believe we're going to see flashback, dream sequence, something along those lines. We see those regularly. I hope we don't see actual time travel, partially because I really don't want them to introduce time travel as canon in the Star Trek in Star Wars universe.
The reason I think this is possible is because there's one, Palpatine's there.
Yep.
And two, there is precedence in the expanded universe for Palpatine having the ability. It may have even been in the animated series, Rebels or something, but there's some reference to him having the ability to use the Force to travel through time.
Yeah, I believe it's in Rebels. I haven't seen Rebels yet, but I believe that's where there is a reference in Rebels or something like that of the idea with it. My thing with it is I think you don't need it. I think you can readily have Palpatine be strong enough to survive the Death Star explosion.
Which is also in the expanded universe, right? Like, he made clones of himself and transferred his conscience into them.
And the idea I even had with this is quite mad. I mean, he's the most powerful Sith Lord that's sort of ever existed in even the expanded universe in many respects.
Well, he also hints that Darth Plagueis, whoever that was, could create life. So maybe he could.
And that's where I think you can come into the thing and basically say, if you want to bring Palpatine back, and there's definitely hints that Palpatine's back, you don't need him to time travel. You can make him powerful enough to have survived.
There's a way to write
around
that.
Yeah, and I would think that that's a much better way to do it, quite frankly.
Yeah, I've also the guys that do Red Letter Media, which is a great movie review site if you haven't read it, but they speculated that there's evidence in the trailer to think that maybe there's time travel involved. One of them is that at the end of Jedi, the Death Star blows up very convincingly.
Well, especially in the special edition.
Yeah, I mean, it is vaporized.
Yeah.
It is space dust at that point. But then there's this giant, massive, 200-mile-long stretch of it landing somewhere
that we've seen in the preview.
Maybe that's not the Death Star. Maybe that's a new Death Star that's being built, or maybe that's from when it's being. I don't know.
Yeah, but I get the things with it.
The real takeaway is that would be awful.
It would be awful. And again, I think you can retcon anything into this without needing time travel. Because you have people who can manipulate anything.
Yeah.
Let's not have them be time travel.
You have space wizards. You don't need time travel.
Yeah, and as people have said, they needed to. There's a lot of argument that J.K. Rowling made a mistake when she introduced time travel into the Harry Potter universe, and she only introduced it in a very limited fashion. And that. I really one of those things where I think it's, time travel is the last refuge of the failed writing attempt.
Cornered writer.
Yeah, and, in
Star Trek 4 did it fine.
It
was a good movie by itself.
Star Trek is actually one of the few that I think has done it very, very well. And I always comment, if anybody hasn't read it, the very first Star Trek novel, The Entropy Effect, I would highly recommend reading as how to do time travel correctly, because there are scenes throughout Entropy Effect. So there's like a scene where Kirk sees Spock walk by the door to the transporter, and he chases after him because he needs to talk to him, and he comes around and he can't find him, and he's like, "What the hell? He didn't do that." And then he goes on, and later he finds him, and that kind of thing. And he's just talking with him. It turns out that Spock ends up going back in time. He walks past the transporter room. Kirk sees the going back in time person. Every occurrence that happens between the interactions of the characters in time travel that occurs after the time travel occurs 2/3 of the way through the book already occurred.
Yeah. On that note...
And it's a great way to do it.
On that note, The Star is My Destination, another book that's not really about time travel, but handles the topic very well.
Yeah.
It's the Count of Monte Cristo in space. Number 15, we learn at least, missed a typo here, we learn at least one new thing that changes our understanding of the original or prequel trilogy. So an obvious one would be that Palpatine is still alive, but we know from the expanded universe so he can come back. So something besides that, something where like once we go back and rewatch the original trilogy, it means something completely different from what we thought.
Yeah, mitochondrians don't actually actually have any force powers.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
It was a censor error.
It's a censor error. Yeah. Yeah, great explanation.
I'm going to say true, because this would be a very J.J. Abrams thing to do.
It is a very J.J. Abrams thing to do. I also think that I would say true as well. And the reason I'm going to say true is because I think Star Wars has been very into filling out things that the fans would just like to have filled out. And the example I use is Rogue One. Tarkin is really a character. And he fits his character. It expands his character. He's very interesting. He's very fun in a way that makes Tarkin in Star Wars make more sense.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, his staying with the Death Star makes so much more sense.
It was his baby.
It was his baby, but it's also he truly believes he has the most powerful thing in the world. Vader's force is just this wizardy power that nobody cares about. Mm-hmm. He believes in military might. He believes he has the most powerful thing, and this is just a distraction. And that's that line, abandon his ship and
a moment of triumph.
In a moment of triumph is such a great sort of statement of his character, and it was a great statement of his character in Star Wars. And I think Tarkin was one of those characters in Star Wars that a lot of fans really enjoyed. And when they went back in Rogue One, they basically made him the character everybody wanted him to be.
Yeah.
Without doing a lot of him. And
I can
believe they're going to do something
Rogue One,
like that.
I thought, did about the best job of filling these story gaps.
Yeah.
But it's still, whenever you have a movie, something like this, it can't be done perfectly.
Yeah,
so
the timing doesn't make any sense with the Tantive 4 at the end.
No, it doesn't quite work. But like the thing I'm thinking of is right before that line Tarkin says, where they tell him to leave, the guy walks up to him and says, "We've analyzed their attack and there is a danger." How would they know that?
Yeah.
The flaw was deeply hidden in the structure of the Death Star, and the rebels had to go break into that base on, what was it called?
Yeah.
Cardiff, or the heck the planet was called.
But it's also, once they had the plans, they knew there was a weakness.
Maybe they knew where to look. Like, why are they flying down this trench?
Yeah. And I think that's the thing, is they fly down the trench, they know they're launching torpedoes.
Throw some plywood over that hole.
Yeah, they know they're launching torpedoes, potentially. And so I think it's the kind of thing where it's like, hey, it turns out that this trench does lead someplace it shouldn't. We found the same thing the rebels did. Once we knew to look for it. We weren't looking for it once we knew to look for it, because that's what they're attacking. We figured it out.
Yep. All right, so one new thing, I'm going to say true.
I'm going to say true just because I think that they're so into doing it right now in conjunction with the Star Wars. And I think I'm going to go a little one step further, and I'm going to say I think it's going to tie something up in the prequel trilogy.
Interesting.
And the reason I'm going to say
that enough
that,
to know what all the open threads are.
The reason I'm going to say that is because I think from a purely business point of view, and it's interesting because I was just listening to another podcast today about how there's a lot of discussions of the business of movies and less discussion of what happens in the movies now. But from a purely business point of view, the fans don't particularly like the original trilogy, the prequel trilogy compared to the original trilogy. I can very well see them sort of putting something in that says, hey, let's treat the prequel trilogy in a slightly different light, just so it's not quite as maligned. And again, that's the kind of thing that I'm going to sort of put in there, as to I could believe they do that. That
would be an interesting coup if they could do something in this movie.
Let me try.
That would make the prequel seem better somehow.
Yeah.
That would be a skill.
I would very well believe they're going to try. Whether or not it's going to work, I think, is another question entirely. But I can very well believe they're going to try.
I like Abrams as a director. He adds a lot of
Abrams as a director. He's always fun.
Kinetic energy. His movies are fun to watch. I don't like him as much as he writes the best first acts.
He does write fantastic first acts. Yes.
But like most people, he's terrible at third acts, because third acts are hard to write. I can't write them either. I'm not bragging about something I can do that he can't. But I'm just thinking, like Lost, like the first season of Lost is one of the best first seasons of any show I've ever saw.
And quite frankly, so are the second and third seasons.
Second season's not bad. It starts to lose some juice.
I think you make it through the third season. I think the fourth season's when it starts to go off the rails.
Yeah, but the ending was just really unsatisfying. I think it's hard to end a show. We saw this with Game of Thrones. We've seen it with a lot of things. It's hard to end a show when almost every fan theory is more interesting than what you came up with. You need to read the boards more.
Yeah.
So, all right. So those are our 15. We'll see how that goes. We're running real long, so we need to wrap this up. Next week, I don't know what next episode. Who knows when that's going to be at this point? Not sure what the topic is.
We have had some requests, I know, from some people who sent me some follow-up things saying they'd like an episode that's a little less academic, just as a little bit of a break of something, because as one of them put it, they're learning too much law.
All right. Maybe we can do like a potpourri, because I've got a whole folder full of like cool legal things that have come out that we could just talk about what those things are. Each one's worth maybe 2 minutes of discussion.
Yep.
So maybe we can do that. So we'll figure it out. If we don't come up with anything else, we'll do the potpourri and just kind of run through some things that have happened in the last couple of months.
And we may also talk about we talked about the idea of doing a movies episode just because I've managed to see quite a bit of movies. I know you have as well. We haven't been a while since we've done
I don't know
as well.
if we talked about, because you saw both of the...
I'm caught up in the Marvel Universe, sort of.
Yeah, so we got that to cover if we haven't yet. All right, there's the music. It's time to go. Check out our website at lggpodcast.com, and it has links to our various platforms where you can download prior episodes and get in touch with us. Get in touch with us on Twitter, on Facebook, by email. Subscribe to this podcast on the platforms. Give us a review that helps new listeners find us. Tweet out our content, promote us, do free work. You can find me on Twitter at Benjamin Siders and Kirk at KirkDMN. That is all for today. We'll see you next time. Lorem, play us out.
The views expressed by the participants of this program are their own and do not represent the views of, nor are they endorsed by Lewis Rice LLC, its officers, directors, employees, agents, representatives, shareholders, and subsidiaries. None of the content should be considered legal advice. As always, consult a lawyer. This podcast was produced and recorded at Cool Fire Studios in St. Louis, Missouri.